How's it, everybody? Welcome back to the Rocky Fern. My name is Luca and I'm OI Type 4. And today's episode of Show Me the Green, we're checking out how to do one of these big boys. This is moss pole, kind of how I do it. Kind of heavily inspired by Sydney Plant Guy, but I kind of show you how my mix is here in subtropical, beautiful Kaua'i. So let's get into it. So this is the moss pole size that I like to use. It's typically a 4-inch diameter here across the top, and I use this 1/2-inch wire grid. I don't use the powder coated stuff. I haven't noticed that there's an issue with it. It does not corrode on me. It doesn't rust, and I've had some of these going for a couple years now. So far it's been great. The 4-inch size gives you a manageable size that's big enough to grow a lot of different plants to pretty big sizes, and without being too heavy, because you have to imagine once this thing's full of water and full of plants, it can be kind of hard to move around. I do make a bunch ahead of time and then just plant into these as I need them. And this particular moss pole has this plastic or rubber backing that I like to use to help prevent it drying out too much. So without further ado, let's get into kind of how I construct it, what the mix is made out of that I have found works really well for me, and kind of how and where to get the products that you need to make one of these. First things first is the wire mesh. I ended up getting this huge roll of it. It's just more economical for me from Amazon. And then just to be upfront and honest, I do have affiliate links to Amazon in the description box. The affiliate links do give me a certain percentage back. I think it's 10% that help go back to supporting the channel. So if you do like what you see here and you want to kind of support the channel in a small way, you can definitely go and use the link to some of these cool products. So that very large spool is 1/2-inch grid size, and I end up cutting a 12-inch piece. And kind of a trick of the trade here is, since they're 1/2-inch, you can just count 24 squares and then cut there. That'll give you 12 inches. A 12-inch circle, or a 12-inch length, will give you roughly a 4-inch tube, or 4-inch moss pole. So that's kind of cool that way. I have played around with 6-inch, I've played around with 8-inch, and they end up just getting too big and too cumbersome to use. Even on some of the more bigger, more robust plants, I don't think I really need a moss pole that big. So I typically use just a 4-inch moss pole, and I ended up getting in the 4-foot length, which is a great length to work with. You can end up doing a chop and extend and do 8 feet if you wanted to, but I have found that the 4-foot works great, and then once it gets to the 4-foot mark, I end up cutting it, keeping both, or the top cut, rooting that, making sure that survives, and then selling the bottom cut. So I'll show you how I end up rolling that. So as far as the plastic backing goes, I like to use the cooler curtains, or the freezer curtains that you can get online. The company I work for was redoing some stuff, and they were throwing these old ones away that are kind of tore up, but they work really, really well to be repurposed for the background or the backing of a moss pole. They're nice and supple, they're durable, they're easy to cut and use, and they're obviously a nice water barrier to keep the moisture in. So that's one tip I like to use, one cheap alternative I've used for some plastic backing. Then I go into my mix. So my mix isn't just pure sphagnum moss, but while we're talking about sphagnum moss, because I live here in Hawaii, it's really hard to source sphagnum moss economically. So I like to get the bricks. So there's advantages and disadvantages to the compressed brick. So you can find this link in the description box. It is a compressed brick. It's a 3.3 pound compressed brick. The disadvantage of a compressed brick is it's super, super compressed. You really have to soak it and kind of break it up that way, or kind of tear it up dry and really process it and mill it so that it's nice and fluffy and ready to use. But if you were to soak it, it would expand really, really quickly and be nice and easy to use. And of course, the advantage is you're getting more bang for your buck. There is this other moss that I've used before. It's more expensive because you're not getting as much for the price, but it's easy to use. You can just use it that day, comes out of the bag, super nice, easy, ready to go. Then I like to mix a third of this sphagnum moss with a third of tree fern fiber. Tree fern fiber is this amazing, amazing product. It's actually pretty expensive as far as the other ingredients go. So I like to use it in a mix of the other ingredients that I use for my moss poles. It doesn't break down as quickly as sphagnum moss does. It does hold water really, really well, and it allows plants' roots to breathe really well. I'd say even more so than sphagnum moss. In fact, if this was a more economic option, I would use strictly tree fern fiber. You want to make sure that you're getting tree fern fiber that is ethically sourced. Usually it's from New Zealand, where they have a very cool, strict system of how to ethically source and conservatively source their tree fern fiber. We do have tree fern here, and I have used some tree fern trunks that have died in my yard or in some of my relatives' yards, or I use the whole trunk as a mounting source for epiphytic plants, mainly orchids, and it works out really, really well. I got this from joshsfrogs.com. It's the biggest bag I could find, and it was the best deal. I think I got it on sale during the holidays, but it's definitely valuable addition to the mix. And then the only other thing I use to help with aeration and to kind of bulk up the mix is cocoa chunks. I'll post a picture right here. I get my cocoa chunks, believe it or not, from Costco. So Costco sells this huge 2-pack. It's more for landscaping purposes, but I have found that it's really low in salts. It's somewhat high quality in the sense that it does have some tidbits of different things in there, like fabric or stones or whatnot, but it's low in salts, and it's good size, and it's a higher quality than I would get from maybe like a Walmart or something like that, and it's huge. So I think both pack, the 2-pack is like 28 bucks shipped, and I'll put a link in the description, but I really like using that cocoa chunk. They have run out in the past, and I was kind of worried that they weren't going to get it back in, but they did since then restock, and I've purchased a couple more orders from them. But here's a video of what the mix looks like up close. You can see that it's very airy. It's very heavy on the sphagnum moss, but it actually holds really, really well. And when I pack the moss poles, one thing I've noticed is if you end up packing it too tightly, it creates a very difficult situation for the plant roots to work their way through. So you do want to err on the side of more airy or lighter packed than heavier packed, but I found that the tree fern fiber addition as well as the cocoa chunks really help prevent that super tight compact packing that you can get with just pure sphagnum, and it jigsaws in a way that it really holds together inside the pole without breaking up or anything like that. The disadvantage with moss poles is they are quite messy, so we're going to be doing this outside. And if you guys have noticed, this is my new background. This is the new back wall for the garage greenhouse, and so we're actually going to start moving stuff from that wooden structure I made and start planting them on this. This I think is going to be a much better ideal situation for the outdoor greenhouse, mainly because it is easy to mount to, easy to place plants where I want them, and it's waterproof, being powder coated still. So it should hold up for quite a long time, but we're going to switch over to kind of a lower setting so you can actually see how I roll out the mesh and how I secure it together, and then how I pack it. And while what goes inside the moss pole is super important, based on your situation, how heavy it rains, how heavy it doesn't rain, how high humidity is and whatnot, it also matters how you pack it in there. So I want to get into kind of how tightly you want to pack these types of moss poles for future success, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to show you kind of how I get started on creating a moss pole. So like I said, these are 4-foot long by 12-inch cuts of that 1/2-inch sheet of wire mesh, and it is very, very sharp. So a couple tricks you can do here is you can use a Dremel to kind of cut off your edges and kind of make sure they're nice and smooth. You can use a metal bandsaw, but I just ended up using snips, and I sipped my way through. And then what I'll do is I'll take a hammer, and you'll see that here just in a sec, but I'll end up all these edges that we have here, which are freaking razor sharp. I don't know if you can see that. Those will end up being tacked down, and you know, DIY moss poles aren't as nice and fun to touch as other moss poles can be, but they're cheap. They're a lot cheaper than you can get, and they're a lot bigger and customizable than most commercial moss poles. And then I secure everything with these 2-inch zip ties. And again, you can find that in our link in the description. But these zip ties are really invaluable. I like them because they last a long time. And while I would like to use a more sustainable product other than plastic, I can't really find a replacement for the amount of moss pulls that I use that would replace these zip ties. But I'm very stingy with how I use these zip ties. And then the only other thing you'll need is some sort of frame or mold to bend the wire over. I've done it without it, and it always ends up looking a little scattywampus or a little off. Whereas when you use a mold or some sort of round tube like this is a 4-inch PVC, or rather 3¼ inch PVC, it helps make everything nice and smooth and uniform. So your moss pulls end up more consistent. Okay, so here's the hammer I'm going to use, and I end up using the hammer because it has this kind of beveled inset to the hammer, and I'll use these insets right here. Try to get close up there. I use these insets and I run it down the side of the wire mesh, and that helps flatten it. So ideally you should be wearing gloves, but I hate wearing gloves, and so I never wear gloves. But you just run it down and it flattens all these edges down pretty uniformly and pretty easily. And it's the fastest thing I've found that will do it. Sometimes you'll have an end that's pointing the other way, so I'll use the hammer to kind of hammer it down. Then when I get to the very end here, I don't want to create that last one. I don't want it to be pointing out, making a tail, so I'll bend it the other way. And then I'll just hammer it all down just to make sure that it's flat. And we end up with something that looks like that versus this. I hope that comes through. So I'll just do the same thing here. Flatten this side. Now again, you can go through and make this nice and flush and sand it down if you wanted to. You could run it over a grinder to cut it. You could run it over a sanding belt to get it nice and smooth and easy to touch, because you will catch yourself occasionally, and sometimes it's so sharp you don't know that you've cut yourself, and then you know you got that to deal with. But this is my preferred way to do it. And when I make moss pulls, I don't make 1 or 2. I end up making a dozen, depending on how much time I have, just because you can always pre-make a moss pull, and you might as well, just to be a little bit more economic on your time use, because you have everything out. But it's no sense, in my opinion, making 1 or 2 just to put everything away again. So if you make a bunch, you can always put some off to the side. Okay, so now that you have your strip and everything's cleaned up, we're gonna end up using probably 8 to 10 zip ties on this. And so what I'll do is I'll grab my little PVC here and I'll just bend it over the wire like this. There you go. Just to kind of get an idea of how it's going to bend. And for some reason, it's always going to want to twist on you, and you're going to end up with the corners not wanting to connect. And I'll show you how I deal with that. So I'll bend it that way, and I'll turn it around, and I'll hurry and bend it this way. There you go. And of course, the goal isn't to get the ends to meet. The goal is just to get that basic frame to bend and a general curvature that you're gonna want. And so you can kind of see it's not gonna meet. But what that allows us to do is to bring the ends together, and then we can kind of do the general final shaping at the end. So I'll always come together at this end, whatever end I choose, and start to zip tie it. And then I don't like to cut the tails off. I just think it makes unnecessary waste. So what I'll do is, you have that little black tail sticking out, I'll just flip it over so it's flush against the rest of the moss pole, and you're on your way. And then what I'll do is I'll come down about 6 inches, 6 to 8 inches, and I'll put another one in, and I'll work my way down the seam of the moss pole till everything's zipped up nice and neat. And in my experience, it doesn't need to be a perfectly sealed seam. You can actually probably end up just with 4 total zip ties and be just fine. Because I've noticed that the mix I use holds together really, really well, and it doesn't seep out of the openings in the seam. So, you know, your results might differ depending on what kind of mix you use. I've also played around with pumice, large grade pumice, and that's worked out really well. But I think the coco coir, or the coco chunk rather, is ideal, at least for me, because it's hard to secure pumice here in the quantities and whatnot that I need, but also it's just as light as pumice is, so that's the ideal situation. When you're going down and zipping up your seams, just making sure that your squares line up so that when you get to the end, your corners line up. I hang all my moss poles. I don't put them in a pot and then stick them on the ground. I like to actually suspend my moss poles with the pot elevated off the ground. I do that for a couple different reasons. A lot of the reasons is because I have chickens and I like to get in there. But the other reason too is if by keeping it off the ground I don't have as many bugs coming up into the planter that I don't want. And then this open end, you can either choose to seal that, or that will end up being the end that goes into the pot. That's kind of the unseen structure. You don't really get to worry about that. But if you notice, there's a twist in this. And so once it's finished, you'll actually just end up untwisting it, or kind of twisting it back to straight. And you'll end up getting a nice even seam. So you can kind of see it's a little bit straighter. And now let's put in, this will be a plastic backed one. Some of the ones I've made so that they're open, and those are usually ones that I have multiple plants on one moss pole. So some of the smaller Rhapidophoras, some of the smaller Scindapsus that I'll actually plant together and have them shingle up one moss pole, and I find that's a better look than one single plant. So those I typically don't put a plastic backing, just so that it's not restrictive on where the plants can root. Now remember, by putting a plastic background, you're kind of restricting what plants can access what parts of the moss pole, because you're only having a little opening here for the plants to root in. So you're kind of dictating where the plant's going to grow, whereas if it's open, it can choose whatever. But we will make this a more restricted type growth by adding that plastic backing. What I'll do real quick is I'll add this moss, or I'll add this template in here real quick, and then I'll just kind of put the seal on the bottom and kind of push toward the seal. That'll give me a much rounder profile if we were to look at it this way. So I'll put the seam down on the ground and kind of push into it using the PVC pipe as a frame. And it ends up working out really, really well. The other thing you can do is just kind of smash down the seam toward the other side of the pole, and that will give you a more rounded look. So I have found that you don't really need to cover the entire length of the moss pole with the plastic backing. And because I'm using the curtains from a cooler, I'm kind of restricted to the width that I want. So typically with a 4-inch moss pole, to get a nice balance between plastic backing and aeration of the moss pole, I'm going to go with anywhere from a 4 to 6 inch wide strip. And that 4 to 6 inch wide strip is going to afford me, I think, a pretty good coverage between water retention and breathability in the mix of the moss pole. And so this one came pre-drilled with some holes, and I'm going to put the holes top end of the moss pole. Okay. There we go. Okay. Keep shoving this in here. Okay. All right. So that's kind of what our moss pole looks like. You can kind of see in there that the top end there is half screen, so that's going to give you a nice balance here of what you're looking for in a moss pole and what the roots are looking for more specifically in a moss pole. Now comes to the kind of fun slash dirty job part of moss poles. Okay, so you can see here I have my bucket full of my medium, and it's a really nice medium. I really like the way this works in our moss poles. So what we're going to do is I want to anchor like a little patch, or my starter patch here of the filling or the medium, about halfway down where my plunger can reach, and then I'll work my way out, and then I'll eventually turn it around and start to work my way down to the end point here, which is where the plastic ends, or the rubber in this case ends, and I'll leave this bottom portion open and free, because that's the part that's going into the pot. So I like to do this over the bucket that has the medium in it. And the reason is because it is really messy. But basically you're going to shove it down and kind of roll it to the point where you want it to anchor and start. And that for me is about, I don't know, a little more than halfway down. And then the trick here, without getting it too compact, is to only do a handful at a time, sometimes a handful and a half at a time. Get it in there. And then what you're going to do, I can make this make sense to you, is you're really going to just start to work all the edges of the moss pole or the moss filling until it's somewhat compact. And then what I'll do is I'll come in from the other end and push up and kind of seal that plug in there. And I work my way from the outside or the outside of the moss, and I work my way toward the middle, and that really gives me a way of kind of jigsawing it in there. And I don't want to cram on it. I really don't want to put a lot of compression on it, because you do want it to be somewhat airy. But just by doing that, you can see that it's now stuck in here. And as I work more and more plugs and build them on top of each other, they end up creating this interlocked filling, this interlocked medium that really does hold roots well, holds water well, but allows breathability. And that's the beauty of a moss pole, is that they allow you to grow aeroids and other plants in a fashion that they have evolved to do so. And sometimes you'll get big gaps. If you can try to fill those big gaps, that's fine. But I've noticed that the big gaps that I wasn't able to seal off, roots will actually form in there and kind of fill them themselves. And so they do like quite a bit of aeration. That's something that I've really noticed. And it makes sense. If you ever see an aeroid growing in situ or in habitat, you'll see that they are going just straight up kind of a really exposed area, but i.e. tree branches or tree trunk, whatever the case is. But in my next video, we're actually going to be transplanting some transplanting some plants that are ready to go on a moss pole. And one of them is an epiphytic gesneriate, an epiphytic violet. And it's a really cool plant. And it's actually going to go on the top end, whereas the aeroid's going to go on the bottom. And they're going to kind of grow together. One grows up, the aeroid would grow up the moss pole, and the gesneriate actually trellises and traipses down and grows that way. So that's kind of a cool way to do it. And you can see that I'm really not cramming this in there. I'm not pushing hard. And I really want to, if I want to travel a lot of distance down the moss pole, I'll actually roll that plug, and I'll keep pushing the bottom and kind of rolling, or the top, and just roll it into place. And then I'll kind of cinch it in, lock it in by doing the outer edges before I tamp in the middle. So I'll keep going this way. And again, this is a very messy. I know that Sydney plant guy, he'll come through at the end and kind of trim everything up, which will make it nice and neat and easier to work with if you're doing it inside like he does a lot of the time. But a lot of my moss poles, actually all of them, are outside. And so I don't do that final aesthetic step, but feel free to, obviously. Okay, then, so that's it. We're on that end. So then what I'll do is and you can see that it's not going anywhere. I'll flip it around and I'll start working this end. Same thing. And of course, because this has the plastic backing, it's much easier to roll the plug. but it's just as easy to do on a non-plastic lined moss pole, believe it or not. The only thing is you do lose quite a bit of the fern filling, but I do notice that it ends up being a pretty good, decent ratio in the mix at the end of, after everything's said and done. So that's kind of cool. And then of course the coco chunks, they really allow for good aeration, and they add porosity, they add a good matrix for the whole system to hold together, because they're irregular shaped and they get kind of jigsawed into each other, and they hold shape really well. I've been really happy with this mix. And you can see just by even me putting that one handful in there at the beginning, it started to interweave and kind of lock up tight. So we're going to keep working our way though to get it to the spot that we need. There's an air pocket right here. That's why I like this window aluminum channel, because it's flat. You can see that it's flat, and it allows me to kind of get past the main plug and work around it. Okay. So one thing I forgot to do that I'm realizing now is I forgot to anchor in the rubber backing, but I don't think it's going anywhere. Usually what I'll do is I'll zip tie one or two ties to the top of the moss pole and kind of anchor them in place, but I didn't do it this time, and I haven't seen a real loss in benefit, so, or real gain in benefit rather in this case. Okay, get it all in there. Clear up this bottom section here real quick. And then what we'll do is get one more little handful to seal it off here. Okay. Nice. And there's a little hiccup here that I'm coming behind the... There you go. So what happened there is I got underneath the plastic backing and I was kind of packing it in, causing that backing to come away from the screen. But what I do is I just come in here and I sweep toward the edge of the plastic, and it allows me to clear it all out and fold that back down, fold that plastic backing back down, and then we are done. So moss poles are great. I'm going to pack this extra little bit just to make sure it's locked in there, and this is it. So this is the new moss pole. Like I said, I try to make about a dozen, so unless of course I only need one, then I'll make the one that I need, but I try to make more than I need so that in the future I don't have to make just one. But this is the moss pole. You can see that it holds well together. And the other thing I'll do to this is I'll fully saturate it and let it drip dry, and then I think it's ready to use. That allows the water to pass through, kind of create those water channels, pathways that it eventually will make, and also it kind of settles everything in place and really locks everything in place so that the jigsaw effect really holds. And then you're ready to plant. So I'll put this into a pretty big pot, just because I know what kind of plant I'm gonna use for this moss pole. It's gonna be my medium silver. It has a really big root system already, and so that's why it's gonna go into a deeper pot. You could kind of channel this down to maybe even only 3 inches of open space if it was a smaller pot. And remember, the cool thing about the moss poles is the root system isn't solely based in the pot. The root system is going to be throughout this entire moss pole. And I've broken these moss poles down after I've been ready to take down a moss pole, and this medium pulls away from the roots really, really well, and it allows the root system to grow incredibly thick and robust. And so I really like this mix again. The only other thing that I might add to this would be charcoal. Horticultural charcoal would be, I think, a really good thing to use in this. And by the way, while we're on the subject of horticultural charcoal, just buy the hardwood chunk charcoal you get anywhere, Home Depot, Walmart, the big bag. Usually it's a big red bag if it's oak. And break it up yourself. You can get the size that you want. You can break it up, mill it up. Yeah, you can break up that whole bag and make tons and tons and tons of horticultural charcoal that will work really, really well for your needs. It's super cheap. You don't get it in the small bags of the more expensive priced horticultural charcoal. And it's just, you know, it's a really good high quality charcoal that you can use. It's not as high quality, it's not as refined as some of the other, you know, specific horticultural charcoals, but I found that it helps out. And being here on an island, it's definitely worth considering your carbon footprint and kind of how you can tweak a product that will work in your favor without having to spend extra money for something that you can find a replacement for. But join me on the next episode where we actually start transplanting a lot of aeroids and putting them on moss poles, taking some smaller moss poles and putting them on some bigger moss poles. That's kind of fun. I have several that definitely need to be upgraded. And if you like what you see, definitely comment below because those help out a ton. Subscribe, give a big thumbs up because it helps the channel out. And I do read all your guys' comments. But until next time, we'll see you on the next adventure.